by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Sarah was sitting on a park bench, an old faded cloth on her lap with a dozen colorful beads forming small bracelets. The only way she had to earn a few coins for food. She sighed, picked up one of the bracelets, and murmured to herself, "If each bracelet paid for one lunch, I'd already own a restaurant." That's when something made her stop. Across the park, sitting on another bench, an 8-year-old boy was crying in a way that broke your heart. No sound, but his whole body was shaking. His face was buried in his knees, and his shoulders trembled as if he was carrying the weight of the world. Sarah frowned. Something about that boy felt different. He was wearing expensive clothes, a blue wool coat, clean sneakers, and a digital watch far too big for his small wrist. He wasn't a street kid. He was a kid lost on the inside. Without thinking twice, Sarah stood up, grabbed a bracelet from her pocket, and walked over to him. "Hey, champ," she said in a soft but cheerful voice. "Is this bench big enough for two, or is it reserved for broken hearts only?" The boy lifted his head. His eyes were full of tears, red and swollen, and he stared at her without saying a word. Sarah sat down anyway. "That's okay. I'll just be the sad extra in your drama if you want. But fair warning, I cry ugly, you know. Red nose, puffy eyes, total disaster." Still nothing. No sound. She tried again. "Did you argue with someone? Skip school? Did something happen?" That's when the boy started moving his hand. Quick, precise motions, but no sound. Sarah blinked, confused, and then her heart started racing. He was using sign language. "Wait, are you talking to me?" she asked, surprised, and quickly responded with trembling hands. "I know a little bit of that, too." The boy froze like he'd seen a ghost. "You understand signs?" he asked with unsure gestures. Sarah smiled and signed. "Yes, a little. My mom taught me. She used to say silence is the most honest language in the world." The boy wiped his tears and signed, "I miss my mom." Sarah paused, his silent words echoed loud inside her. "Where is she?" "In heaven," he signed, head down. "She died 2 years ago. Since then, my dad only works. He doesn't talk to me." Sarah's expression softened. His pain was pure, raw. She knelt beside him, letting the beads fall to the ground. "Hey, look at me." She signed slowly. "You're an amazing kid. Did you know that?" He looked at her, unsure. Because even with all this, she pointed around them at the cold, the wind, the rushing world. "You still have the courage to cry. That means your heart is still alive." He stayed quiet, taking in every word. Sarah then did what she did best, turned sadness into laughter. "But seriously, if you keep crying like that, you're going to attract every pigeon in town. They love drama. By gossips. They go like this." She started imitating a pigeon, bobbing her neck and making silly faces. "Look over there, the fancy coat kid crying in front of the homeless lady." The boy let out a small giggle, half shy, half confused. But it was real. Sarah smiled wide. "There it is. First smile of the day. See? Still works." Meanwhile, across the street inside a discreet black car, Edward Harrington, the billionaire and the boy's father, was watching everything. He had rushed out in a panic after the security guard told him his son had run away. He'd spent hours driving around the city until he found him there, sitting with a stranger, but what left him frozen was this. The smile. Ethan was smiling a light, natural smile, something Edward hadn't seen since the day they buried his wife. He gripped the steering wheel, not knowing what to feel. Part of him wanted to run over and hug his son. Another part was breathless, just watching this unexpected scene. Sarah and Ethan kept signing to each other. "So, you're like a silence spy," she joked. He replied, laughing. "Something like that." For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still, but the spell broke when a tall man in a black suit came running up. "Ethan," he called, out of breath. "Oh my God, I finally found you." The boy got startled. "That's my dad's driver." He signed quickly. Sarah stood up, confused. "It's okay. He was just talking with me." The driver looked her up and down, suspicious. "Mr. Harrington is waiting." Before leaving, Ethan turned and signed to her. "Bye, Sarah." She smiled and replied, "Bye, spy." The black car pulled away, disappearing among the tall buildings. Sarah stood still, staring into the distance with a strange feeling that something important had just happened. Little did she know that this brief encounter, full of tears and laughter, would be the beginning of something that would change her life forever and everyone else's too. That night, Sarah couldn't get the boy out of her mind. Lying on the park bench wrapped in a thin blanket full of holes, she looked up at the stars and thought about Ethan, his shy smile, the tears that had run down his small face. She sighed, adjusting the old backpack that served as a pillow. That kid has everything: fancy clothes, name-brand shoes, a watch that probably costs more than a car, but he's all alone, she whispered to herself. Rich and sad. What a strange mix. She turned on her side, trying to find a more comfortable position on the cold bench. I bet his dad doesn't even know he cries. Probably too busy counting money or having meetings with other people in suits. Meanwhile, across town, inside a mansion that looked more like a museum, Edward Harrington was still awake. He paced back and forth across the room, tie loosened, hair slightly messy. In his hand he held a glass of whiskey he had barely touched. The image of his son smiling wouldn't leave his mind. 2 years. 2 whole years without seeing that smile. He walked over to the window and looked down at the glowing city. Millions of people, millions of lives, and none of them had been able to make Ethan smile until a stranger sitting on a park bench did the impossible in just a few minutes. He ran his hand over his face, exhausted. Who was that woman? He asked out loud into the silence. How did she do in 5 minutes what I haven't been able to do in 2 years? He took a sip of the whiskey and closed his eyes. He knew what he had to do. He stood there for hours until the sky began to brighten. When the sun came up, Edward made a decision. He put on a coat, grabbed his car keys, and left. He had to find her. The park was empty when Edward arrived. It was just after 7 in the morning. He parked the car and walked to the bench where he had seen Ethan the day before. Nothing. He walked a little farther, scanning every corner, every shadow, and then he saw her. Sarah was sitting on the ground, leaning against a tree with her faded cloth spread out in front of her. The beaded bracelets were neatly lined up, and she was chewing on a piece of stale bread. Edward stopped a few feet away, watching. She looked so light. Even there, sitting on the cold ground with nothing, there was something about her that radiated life. He took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and calm. Sarah squinted at him. "Good morning. Can I help you? If you're here to buy a bracelet, they're $5 each. If you're here to ask for money, I'm sorry, but I'm the one doing the asking." Edward almost smiled, but held back. "My name is Edward Harrington." Sarah kept staring at him, confused. "Nice. I'm Sarah. Nobody. Pleasure." He almost laughed again, but then he took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I'm the father of the boy you met yesterday, Ethan." Sarah's face changed instantly. She jumped to her feet, brushing her hands on her old pants. "Ethan, the little boy who was crying. Is he okay? Did something happen?" "He's fine," Edward answered quickly. "Better than he's been in a long time, actually." Sarah relaxed a bit, but was still looking at him with suspicion. "So, what do you want with me?" Edward hesitated. This conversation was harder than he thought. "I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday." Ethan hadn't smiled in 2 years, not since his mother passed away. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. "I'm sorry. And yesterday," Edward's voice cracked a little. "Yesterday was the first time I saw my son smile again." There was a heavy silence between them. Sarah crossed her arms, but her expression had softened. "He's an amazing kid. He just needed someone to really see him." Edward swallowed hard. Her words hurt more than they should have. "I know," he said quietly. Sarah tilted her head, studying the man in front of her. He looked powerful, important, but also lost. "Let me guess," she said, now with a sharper tone. "You're the kind of dad who works so much he forgets he has a kid at home, right?" Edward stared at her, surprised by her bluntness. "Oh, so you're the busy dad who prefers spreadsheets over hugs." He didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever dared. Sarah went on with no mercy, but every word hit like the truth. "You know what the problem is with people like you? You think money fixes everything, that paying for an expensive school, designer clothes, imported toys, that's love. But it's not. Kids don't want an allowance. Kids want attention. They want you to put down your phone and ask how their day went. They want you to sit on the floor and play, even if it feels silly. They want you to be there." Edward pressed his lips together. Every word hit like a sharp blade. "Ethan doesn't need a rich father," she finished, eyes locked on him. "He needs a present one." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward took a deep breath, taking it all in. He could have been offended, could have walked away, but he didn't, because deep down he knew she was right. "You're right," he admitted, voice low. "I failed him." Sarah blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected him to agree. "But I want to change that. Edward went on, looking straight into her eyes. "And I think you can help me." "Me?" Sarah almost laughed. "How?" "I want you to work at my house as a nanny. Ethan needs someone like you." Sarah froze for a second. She thought she'd misheard. "Sorry, what?" "I'm serious." She let out a loud, honest laugh and shook her head. "You've got to be kidding. Did you hit your head on the way here?" "I'm not joking. Look at my resume, pal." Sarah opened her arms, pointing at the bracelets scattered on the ground. "I sell bracelets on the street. I sleep under a store awning. My last steady job was 3 years ago, and I got fired for arguing with the manager." "You really want me to take care of your kid?" "Yes." The answer came fast, firm, without hesitation. "But I'm not a nanny. I can barely take care of myself." Edward stepped forward. "You made my son smile. In 5 minutes, you did what I couldn't in 2 years. That's worth more than any degree." Sarah swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to believe him, but the other part, the part that had been let down so many times, told her to be cautious. "And what do I get out of this?" she asked, challenging. "A fair salary, a place to live, meals, and the chance to make a difference in a child's life." Sarah looked at him, searching for any sign of a lie, a trap, but all she saw was honesty. She took a few steps, thinking, biting her lip, "This is crazy." "Maybe," Edward admitted, "but sometimes crazy is the only sensible thing to do." Sarah stopped and looked at him again. "You really think I can help?" "I'm sure of it." She took a deep breath, looking around the park, the bracelets, the life she knew. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And suddenly, there was someone offering something different, something impossible. "All right," she said, barely believing her own words. "But if this is some kind of prank, I swear I'll sell bracelets outside your company's front door." Edward smiled for the first time. Sarah picked up her things, stuffed the bracelets into her old backpack, and looked at him with a smirk. "I hope your house has a decent bathroom, because I haven't showered in 3 days. And I smell like a wet pigeon." Edward couldn't help but laugh. And just like that, not really knowing what she was getting into, Sarah took the first step toward a whole new life. Edward drove in silence, focused on the road. Sarah looked out the window, watching the city go by: fancy shops, upscale restaurants, well-dressed people rushing by with brand-name bags. "So," she started, breaking the silence, "is your house far?" "About 20 minutes from here." 20 minutes driving or 20 minutes walking?" "Driving." Sarah let out a low whistle. "Wow. I could walk all day and still not leave my block." Edward chuckled briefly but said nothing. She kept looking out the window, but the anxiety started to build. What was she doing? Getting into a stranger's car? Going to a house she didn't know to care for a child she just met? "Hey," she said, turning to Edward, "just so you know, if you're some kind of crazy kidnapper, I can scream really loud, and I bite too." Edward nearly choked on his own breath. "I'm not a kidnapper. That's exactly what a kidnapper would say." He shook his head, trying to hide a smile. When they finally arrived, Sarah was speechless. The mansion was huge, 3 stories, a huge garden, automatic gates, and a fountain right in the middle of the driveway. It looked like something out of a soap opera. "Oh my goodness," Sarah murmured, stepping out of the car and looking around. "Is this a house or a hotel?" "It's my house." "You live in all of this alone?" "No. I live with Ethan, and we have a few staff." Sarah did a full circle, taking in every detail. "You could fit about 50 people in here. Easy." Edward locked the car and motioned for her to follow. "Come on, I'll show you the inside." As soon as the main doors opened, Sarah felt like she had stepped into another world. The floor was polished marble, a giant chandelier hung from the ceiling, wide stairs looked like they belonged in a castle, and the paintings on the walls probably cost more than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. She stopped in the middle of the entrance hall, slowly turning around. "Is this for real? Do people actually live here or just visit on special occasions?" Before Edward could answer, a middle-aged woman appeared from one of the hallways. She wore a spotless uniform, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, and had an expression that could freeze water. "Mr. Harrington," she said formally, "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing company." Edward turned to Sarah. "This is Margaret, the housekeeper." Sarah waved and smiled. "Hi, Margaret. Nice to meet you." "I'm Sarah." Margaret looked her up and down, examining every detail: the worn-out clothes, the old backpack, the scuffed sneakers. Her nose wrinkled slightly, as if she had caught a bad smell. "Nice to meet you," she said without a trace of warmth. "Sarah will be working here," Edward explained. "She's going to be Ethan's new nanny." A cold silence followed. Margaret blinked as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Nanny?" she repeated, barely hiding her disbelief. "That's right. Margaret opened her mouth to say something but held back. Instead, she forced a polite smile. Understood. I'll prepare a room for her. Thank you, Margaret. The housekeeper walked away, but not before throwing one last sharp glance at Sarah. I don't think she liked me very much, Sarah said as soon as Margaret disappeared down the hall. Don't mind her. Margaret's tough with new people, tough or just unfriendly. Edward didn't answer. At that moment, a door opened upstairs and Ethan came running down the steps. When he saw Sarah, his face lit up. He rushed down the last few steps and stopped in front of her, signing quickly and excitedly. Sarah smiled and replied in sign language, "Hey, champ, did you miss me?" Ethan nodded eagerly again and again, then hugged her a tight, sincere hug full of relief. Sarah felt her chest tighten. It had been so long since someone hugged her like that, like she mattered. All right, she said gently, stroking the boy's head. I'm here now. Edward watched the scene from a distance, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something warm in his chest. Something he no longer knew how to name. In the days that followed, Sarah and Ethan settled into a routine. Every morning after breakfast, they'd sit in the living room and make up games, simple games, made only with gestures and laughter. See that vase over there? Sarah signed, pointing to a very expensive porcelain vase in the corner of the room. I bet it costs more than a car. Ethan laughed and signed. Way more. So let's pretend it's the king of the room, and we have to bow every time we pass by it. She stood up and made an exaggerated bow to the vase, and Ethan burst out laughing. The two of them spent the whole morning greeting furniture like royalty. In the afternoon, they invented a mime show. Sarah pretended to be a living statue, and Ethan tried to make her laugh. He made silly faces, danced in a funny way, pretended to trip, and every time she laughed, he celebrated like he had won a prize. Edward watched everything from a distance, hiding behind the office door, and for the first time in years, he smiled a real smile, one that came from inside. But not everything was perfect. One afternoon, while Sarah was helping Ethan with a giant puzzle in the living room, Margaret showed up. She carried a tray with tea, but the look she gave Sarah was anything but friendly. "Tea, miss," she said, setting the tray on the table with more force than necessary. "Thank you, Margaret." The housekeeper stood there watching. Sarah tried to ignore it, but her presence felt heavy, uncomfortable. "May I ask you something?" Margaret said after a long silence. Sarah looked up. "Sure. Where are you from?" "From the Central Square, and before that..." Sarah frowned. "Before that, I lived in lots of places. Why do you ask?" Margaret gave a cold smile. "I just want to understand what kind of person Mr. Harrington brought into this house." The tone was clear, accusing, suspicious. Sarah stood up slowly, meeting the housekeeper's eyes. "The kind of person who's doing the job no one else here could..." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Be careful, girl," she said in a low, threatening voice. "People like you don't last long around here." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine but didn't let it show. Instead, she smiled. "Then I better enjoy it while it lasts, right?" Margaret turned around and left the room without saying another word. Ethan, who had watched everything in silence, signed, "Is she mean?" Sarah shook her head and signed back. "No, she's just afraid of losing her place." But deep down, Sarah knew it was more than fear. It was a threat, and she needed to stay alert because in that big, quiet, luxurious house, something was hidden. Something she couldn't see yet but could feel in the air. And Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to find out what it was. The next morning, Sarah woke up early. The room Margaret had prepared for her was bigger than any place she had ever slept in. The bed was soft, the sheets smelled like lavender, and there was even a window with a view of the garden. Still, she had trouble sleeping. She was used to street noise, cold wind, and the hardness of a park bench. She got up, put on the cleanest clothes she had, and went downstairs to the kitchen. There, she found Ethan sitting at the table, stirring a bowl of cereal absent-mindedly. Sarah walked over and signed, "Good morning, champ. Did you sleep well?" He nodded yes, but his eyes were distant. She sat next to him and watched for a moment. There was something different in the way he looked out the window, like he was searching for something that wasn't there anymore. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah signed. Ethan turned to her. "Do you think about your mom a lot?" The boy's face changed. He lowered his eyes and nodded slowly. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew she was stepping into sensitive territory, but felt it was something she needed to do. "You know what I used to do when my mom died?" She signed gently. "I used to talk to her even though I knew she wasn't here anymore." Ethan looked up, curious. "I'd talk about my day, the funny things that happened, how I was feeling, and you know what I found out? That talking to her made me feel less alone. Ethan sat quietly, thinking about every word. Sarah smiled and went on. Want to learn a special way to talk to her? He nodded yes eagerly. Then come with me. The two of them went out to the garden. The morning sun lit up the flowers, and the air was fresh and clean. Sarah pointed to the sky and began to sign. Every time you want to talk to your mom, look up at the sky and sign like you're sending her secret messages. It can be anything, a hi, a miss you, or even a silly joke. Ethan looked up at the sky, hesitating. Try it, Sarah encouraged him. He took a deep breath, raised his hands, and made a simple sign. Hi, Mom. Sarah felt her eyes sting but held back the tears. Perfect. Now tell her something that happened today. Ethan thought for a moment, and then signed to the sky. Today I met Sarah. She's funny. I think you'd like her. Sarah had to look away for a second to hide it. When she pulled herself together, she smiled at the boy. I'm sure your mom is listening, and I bet she's smiling too. They stayed there for a few more minutes, Ethan signing to the sky and Sarah beside him, respectfully silent. On the other side of the garden, hidden behind one of the windows, Edward was watching. He had come downstairs to get coffee and ended up seeing the whole scene. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the gestures, saw the way Ethan looked up with hope in his eyes. And for the first time since he buried his wife, Edward felt that maybe there was a way back into his son's heart. The next few days were different. Sarah started teaching Ethan new ways to connect with his mom. They wrote little letters and let the wind carry them, drew stars on paper and wrote her name on them, hummed songs she used to play on the piano. Edward started joining them too, at first shy and clumsy. But little by little, he opened up. He sat with them in the garden, listened to Ethan talk about his mom, and even tried a few basic signs. One evening after putting Ethan to bed, Edward found Sarah in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. Thank you, he said. Standing in the doorway, Sarah looked up. For what? For giving me my son back. She smiled, closing the book. He's always been here. You just had to look. Edward walked over and sat in the armchair next to hers. You're amazing, you know that? Sarah shrugged. I just do what anyone with a heart would do. There was a warm silence between them. Then Edward sighed. I have to go to an important dinner next week with some business people. It's a formal, boring thing, but it has to be done. Good luck with that. The thing is, I need to go with someone. Sarah gave him a sideways look, and I was thinking, would you like to go with me? Sarah nearly choked. Me? You must be out of your mind. Hit your head or something. I'm being serious. Edward, I barely know how to use a dessert fork, and you want to take me to dinner with rich people. I do. Why? He went quiet for a moment, like he was trying to find the right words. Because you're real, and I need someone real by my side. Sarah shook her head, laughing nervously. This is crazy. Maybe. But you already said yes to one of my crazy ideas before. Why not say yes to another? She looked at him, searching for any sign he was joking. But he wasn't. Okay. She finally said, but if I mess something up, it's your fault. Edward smiled. Deal. The week flew by. Sarah spent her days with Ethan and her nights nervous, thinking about the dinner. When the big day finally came, Margaret showed up in her room with a dress. Mr. Harrington asked me to bring you this. It was a simple dress but elegant emerald green with a cut that flattered without overdoing it. Sarah held it up, stunned. He bought this for me? Apparently, Margaret left without saying anything else. When Sarah came down the stairs that evening, she was unrecognizable. Her hair was down, the dress fit perfectly, and she wore light makeup that made her eyes stand out. Edward was waiting in the entryway, adjusting his watch. When he saw her, he froze mid-movement. His heart skipped a beat. His hands got sweaty. He couldn't breathe for a second, just stared. He didn't know she could look even more beautiful. He didn't know he'd feel that way. You look, he began but couldn't finish. Ridiculous, Sarah said. Stepping down the last few steps. Beautiful, he corrected, still breathless. She blushed. Oh, please. I look like a giraffe in high heels. Edward laughed, but couldn't take his eyes off her. Shall we? The dinner was at an upscale restaurant in downtown Manhattan. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, and a pianist playing in the background. Sarah felt completely out of place but tried to hide it. Edward introduced her to the businessmen at the table. They were polite, but there was something in their eyes, something judgmental. One of them, a man in a gray suit with a gray beard, looked Sarah up and down and commented in a low voice but loud enough to hear. Interesting choice of company. Harrington. Where'd you find her? In the gutter? The table went silent. Sarah felt her blood boil. Edward opened his mouth to say something, but she was quicker. "Actually, it was a park bench," she said, smiling sweetly. "But don't worry, I've taken a shower since then." Some laughed, others just stared. The man blushed, unsure how to react. Sarah went on with as much irony as she could gather. "And what about you? Where'd you learn manners? Because clearly it wasn't a very good place." The table burst out laughing. Even Edward, trying to stay composed, let out a genuine laugh. The rest of the dinner went smoothly, but the next day, everything blew up. A photo of Sarah next to Edward at the restaurant leaked online. Within hours, it was everywhere, and the media had no mercy. The CEO's homeless date, from the streets to a billionaire's arm. Edward Harrington's new flame raises eyebrows. Sarah saw the headlines on the phone Edward had lent her. Every word felt like a knife. Edward tried to control the damage. He called his team, asked them to take down the posts, but it was too late. The internet doesn't forget. When he found her in the garden, she was sitting on a bench, staring into space. "Sarah, I'm leaving," she said without looking at him. "No, this isn't for me. Edward, I don't belong in this world. You belong by my son's side, and that's all that matters." She finally looked at him, her eyes full of tears. "They called me a homeless woman. So what? You're more than any of them will ever be." Sarah shook her head and stood up. "I need to think." Before he could say another word, she went inside, leaving Edward alone in the garden, heart aching and scared of losing her. 2 heavy days passed in silence. Sarah barely left her room. She stared out the window, thinking, trying to figure out where she fit in this world that didn't feel like hers. Ethan knocked on her door several times, asking her to play, but she just smiled and said she needed to rest. Edward had also tried to talk, but she always found a reason to leave the room. On the second night, Sarah made a decision. She waited until everyone was asleep. The house was quiet, only the ticking of the wall clock echoed through the halls. She grabbed her old backpack, stuffed the few things she had inside, and looked around the room one last time. The place was beautiful, comfortable, safe, but it wasn't hers. Before leaving, she found a piece of paper and a pen in the drawer. With a trembling hand, she wrote, "I wasn't born to live in a castle. Thank you for everything. Take good care of Ethan. Sarah." She left the note on the bed, grabbed her backpack, and tiptoed down the stairs. Her heart was pounding like she was doing something wrong, but she knew it was the right thing to do, or at least she thought so. She slowly opened the front door, praying it wouldn't make a sound. It worked. She stepped into the yard, crossed the gate, and disappeared into the early morning darkness. When Ethan woke up, the first thing he did was run to Sarah's room. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He slowly opened it and found the room empty. The bed was neatly made, and on top of it, a piece of paper. He picked up the note and read it. He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. Sarah was gone. Panic took over. He ran down the hallway, stumbled down the stairs, and rushed into the office where Edward was working. Edward looked up from his computer, surprised. "Ethan, what's wrong?" The boy started signing frantically, his gestures quick and desperate. "Sarah, she's gone. I need to find her." Edward felt the floor fall out from under him. He jumped up, grabbed the note Ethan was holding, and read it quickly. "No." He crumpled the paper in his hand, his heart racing. Ethan kept signing, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please, I need her." Edward looked at his son, saw the desperation in his eyes, and something inside him broke. He picked up the phone, called his assistant, and said something he had never said before. "Cancel all my meetings today. Mr. Harrington, cancel everything." He hung up, grabbed the car keys, and looked at Ethan. "Let's go find her." They left together, Edward, driving through the streets of New York, while Ethan stared out the window, searching for any sign of Sarah. They passed by the park where it all began empty. They drove around the block. Nothing. They went to all the places Edward thought she might be. Then finally, they saw her. She was sitting on the ground in front of a bakery, her faded cloth spread out with the beaded bracelets neatly lined up, as if she had never left. Edward parked the car and got out quickly. Ethan followed. Sarah saw them coming and lowered her head. "I knew you'd find me," she said without looking up. Edward stopped in front of her, taking a deep breath to steady his voice. "Why did you leave?" "Because I don't belong there. You belong next to my son." Sarah finally looked up, and her eyes were red. "I saw the news, Edward. I saw what they're saying about me. I don't want Ethan growing up hearing that his father is with a homeless woman." Edward knelt down to her level. "You don't understand. I didn't hire you out of pity. I hired you because my son smiles when you're around, because you brought him back to life. And me too. Sarah blinked, surprised. You're not just the nanny, Sarah. You're part of our family now. She was about to answer when she felt someone hugging her. It was Ethan kneeling beside her, arms wrapped around her neck. Crying, Sarah closed her eyes and hugged him back, her heart tight. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, champ. I'll come back." Ethan pulled back, wiped his tears, and signed, "Promise?" She smiled and signed back, "Promise." Edward offered his hand to help her up. "But I have one condition," Sarah said, still holding his hand. "What is it?" "I want freedom. No labels, no red carpet, no pretending to be someone I'm not. If I come back as me." Edward smiled. "I don't want you to be anyone else." Sarah picked up her backpack, packed the bracelets, and followed them back to the car. When they arrived at the mansion, something felt different. Sarah sensed it as soon as she stepped in. The air was heavier, like someone had disturbed something. She went upstairs and stopped at the door. The drawers were open, clothes thrown across the bed. The backpack she had packed was dumped on the floor. Someone had been in there. Her heart raced. She looked around, searching for anything out of place. And then she saw it on top of the dresser. One of her handmade bracelets was broken, snapped in half. That wasn't an accident. It was a message. Sarah picked up the broken bracelet and held it tightly in her hand. She knew exactly who was behind it. She rushed downstairs and found Margaret in the hallway carrying clean towels. "Someone went into my room," Sarah said straight to the point. Margaret looked at her with fake surprise. "Are you sure?" "Maybe you left it messy." "I didn't leave anything messy. And someone broke one of my things." Magasrogel. Maybe it was the wind. Wind doesn't open drawers. They stared at each other. The silence was tense, full of unspoken accusations. "Be careful what you're suggesting," Margaret said, her voice low and threatening. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm saying it." Margaret took a step forward. "You're nothing but an intruder, and intruders don't last long here." Sarah didn't back down. "Then you better get used to me, because I'm not going anywhere." Margaret pressed her lips together, turned her back, and walked off, her heels hitting the floor hard. Sarah stood in the hallway, her heart still racing. She knew this was just the beginning. Margaret wasn't going to give up easily. She went back up to her room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, staring at the broken bracelet. Someone was trying to sabotage her. Someone wanted her gone, and Sarah needed to find out who it was before it was too late. But one thing she knew for sure, she wasn't going to let them push her out, not this time, because for the first time in a long while, she had something worth fighting for. A family, a purpose, and a place that, even if not perfect, was starting to feel like home, and no one was going to take that from her without a fight. The next morning, Edward had to leave early for the company. There was an important meeting with investors that couldn't be rescheduled. Before he left, he stopped by Sarah's room. "I'll be gone all day," he said, standing in the doorway. "But if anything happens, call me." Sarah was sitting on the bed, still deep in thought. "All right." Edward hesitated as if he wanted to say more, but just nodded and left. As soon as his car disappeared through the gate, Sarah felt a chill. Something in the air felt different, wrong. She went down to the kitchen, where Ethan was already waiting with a smile on his face. They had breakfast together, joking in sign language about which cereal was the best. Sarah pretended the chocolate cereal was an army invading the honey cereal's territory, and Ethan laughed so hard he almost choked. But the peace didn't last. Margaret entered the kitchen with firm steps and a stern face. "Sarah, I need to speak with you now." Sarah exchanged a look with Ethan and stood up. "What is it?" "Come with me." They walked into the main living room where the rest of the household staff were already gathered. The driver, the cook, the cleaning lady, all of them looking at Sarah with puzzled expressions. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster. Margaret crossed her arms and pointed to the coffee table. "Someone stole money from Mr. Harrington's safe." Sarah blinked, confused. "And what does that have to do with me?" "I found the money in your bag." Silence filled the room. Sarah felt the ground shake beneath her feet. "What? That's not true." Margaret opened Sarah's bag, which was sitting on the couch, and pulled out a bundle of bills tied with a rubber band. "Not true? Then explain this." Sarah was speechless. She looked at the money, then at Margaret, then at the others. They were all staring at her with suspicion. "I didn't take that. Someone planted it in my bag." "Sure," Margaret said with sarcasm, "the same old excuse. I'm telling the truth." Margaret picked up the phone. "I'm calling the police." "No, wait." But Margaret was already dialing. Sarah felt panic rising inside her. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not when she had finally found a place to belong. 15 minutes later, 2 police officers were in the living room. One of them, a tall man in a blue uniform, picked up the money and examined it. "This money was found in her bag?" he asked, pointing at Sarah. "Yes," Margaret replied firmly. "And you're the owner of the house?" "No, I'm the housekeeper, but the owner is currently away." The officer turned to Sarah. "What's your version of the story?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "I didn't steal anything. Someone put that money in my bag to set me up. And who would do that?" Sarah looked straight at Margaret but didn't say a word. She knew no one would believe her. The other officer picked up the bag and started searching through it. "We're going to need to take you to the station to give a statement." "No, please. I didn't do anything." That's when Ethan came running into the room. He saw the officers, saw Sarah surrounded, and panic took over him. He began signing frantically, trying to explain that Sarah was innocent, that she'd never do such a thing, that Margaret was lying, but no one understood. The officers looked at the boy, confused by the gestures. Margaret pretended not to notice. "What's he doing?" one of the officers asked. "He's deaf," Sarah explained, her voice trembling. "He's trying to say I'm innocent. You understand sign language?" "I do. And he's telling the truth. I didn't steal anything." The officer sighed. "Look, miss, we're still going to need you to come with us." Tears stung Sarah's eyes. Everything was falling apart again. That's when the front door burst open. Edward walked in like a storm, his suit wrinkled, his face red with anger. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to him. Ethan ran and threw himself into his father's arms, signing desperately. "Mr. Harrington," Margaret began, her voice calm, "I'm sorry to say this, but we found the stolen money from your safe in Sarah's bag." Edward looked at Sarah, then at the police officers, then back at Margaret. "Stop this right now." "But sire," I said, "stop." He walked over to the officers. "There will be no statement. There was no theft. But the money, I gave Sarah permission to use my money whenever she needs it. No crime was committed." Margaret turned pale. "But sire," Edward cut her off with a cold stare. "Wait here." He left the room and went straight to the office. 2 minutes later, he came back holding a tablet. "I want everyone to see this." He opened the security camera app and played the video. The footage clearly showed Margaret entering Sarah's room, opening her bag, and putting the money inside. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret tried to speak, but no words came out. "Can you explain this?" Edward asked, his voice dangerously low. It was a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" "You set her up. You tried to ruin the life of an innocent person." Margaret stepped back. "Please, Mr. Harrington, you're fired. I want you out of my house within the hour." "No, please, I've worked here for 10 years. And you threw it all away out of jealousy." Edward turned to the officers. "I'm sorry for the trouble. As you can see, there was no theft. It was a setup." The officers exchanged looks and put away their notepads. "We understand. Sorry for the inconvenience." They left, and Margaret, her eyes filled with tears, went upstairs to pack her things. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, still trying to process everything. Edward walked toward her slowly. "Are you all right?" She shook her head, tears finally streaming down her face. "I can't take this anymore. I can't stand being humiliated again. I know, and I'm sorry. I think I should leave." Edward took her hand, firm but gentle. "Please stay. I need you here, and not just because of my son." Sarah looked up, surprised. There was something different in the way he looked at her, something that went beyond gratitude. The mood shifted. The air between them felt warmer, heavier. Edward stepped closer, and Sarah didn't move away. They stood there, eyes locked, hearts beating in sync. Then Edward's phone rang. He closed his eyes in frustration but answered, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was tense, urgent. "Mr. Harrington, we have a problem. The company is under investigation for corruption. The FBI just arrived." Edward felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "They're seizing documents. They say there's evidence of tax fraud and money laundering." "That's impossible." "Sir, you need to come back now." Edward hung up, his face pale. Sarah touched his arm. "What is it?" He looked at her, and for the first time, Sarah saw fear in his eyes. "My company is being investigated for corruption." And in that moment, Sarah realized the storm was just beginning. Edward ran out of the mansion without even saying a proper goodbye. Sarah stood in the living room listening to the sound of his car disappearing into the distance. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, signing, "What's going on?" Sarah knelt down and signed back, "Your dad has a problem at work, but everything will be okay." She wasn't sure she believed her own words. In the hours that followed, the news exploded. Every TV channel was talking about the scandal. Edward Harrington's company was being investigated for financial crimes, suspicions of fraud, forged documents, embezzled money. Sarah watched it all on the living room television, her stomach in knots. The images showed Edward entering the company building surrounded by lawyers and reporters. Camera flashes exploded in his face. Microphones were shoved in front of him. "Mr. Harrington, is it true you diverted millions of dollars? How long has this fraud been going on? Do you have a statement?" Edward didn't say a word. He just walked into the building, his face grim. Sarah turned off the TV, unable to watch anymore. Ethan sat beside her, staring at the dark screen. "Is my dad guilty?" he signed. "No," Sarah answered firmly. "Your dad is a good man. Someone's lying." In the days that followed, things only got worse. The newspapers printed more and more aggressive headlines. Edward's reputation was being torn apart. Company stock dropped sharply. Clients canceled contracts. And worst of all, Ethan started having trouble at school. Sarah found out one day when she picked him up. He got in the car with his head down, eyes red. "What happened?" she signed, worried. "The kids are saying my dad is a thief." Sarah's heart broke. "They don't know anything. Don't listen to them." But Ethan started to shut down again. He stopped smiling, stopped playing, went back to the silence Sarah had seen on that first day, and she wasn't going to let that happen. That night, while Ethan was sleeping, Sarah had an idea. She picked up the phone Edward had given her, adjusted the room's lighting, and hit the record button. "Hi everyone," she began, a little shy in front of the camera. "My name is Sarah, and I want to teach you something really special." She showed her hands and began to sign. "This is sign language. It's a way to talk without using words. And you know why I'm teaching this? Because I met an amazing little boy who showed me that sometimes the most important things don't need to be spoken out loud." She went on teaching basic signs: hello, thank you, friend, love. And then at the end of the video she spoke about empathy. We live in a world that judges people all the time. But do we really know their stories? Do we know what they're going through on the inside? Before judging someone, how about we try to understand them? She posted the video on a social network and went to bed without expecting much. The next morning, she woke up to her phone exploding with notifications. The video had gone viral, thousands of views, hundreds of comments. "This is beautiful. I'm crying. We need more people like her in the world. Who is this woman? She's amazing." Sarah was in shock, but she didn't stop there. She made more videos, taught more signs, shared stories about Ethan without revealing his name. She talked about resilience, about love, about starting over, and little by little, things started to change. People began to see Edward differently, not as the cold businessman accused of fraud, but as a father fighting to reconnect with his son. Comments started to appear. "If Sarah believes in him, I do too. A man who inspires that much loyalty can't be bad. Let's give him a chance to explain before we judge." The tide was turning. Meanwhile, Edward was working day and night with his lawyers, reviewing documents, looking for proof, trying to find who had set him up. And finally, after exhausting days, he found out 2 executives from the company, driven by greed, had stolen money and forged documents in Edward's name. They thought he'd never find out. But they underestimated a man fighting for his honor. The evidence was turned over to the FBI. The guilty parties were arrested, and the investigation against Edward was closed. When he came home that night, he looked 10 years older, eyes sunken, face pale, shoulders slumped. Sarah was waiting in the living room. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "It's over," he replied, collapsing onto the couch. She sat beside him without saying a word, just stayed there, quiet, offering her presence. After a few minutes, Edward spoke. "Thank you for the videos, for standing up for me when no one else did. I just told the truth." He turned to her, and there was something different in his eyes. "How did you end up on the streets, Sarah?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I want to really know you." Sarah took a deep breath. It had been a long time since she talked about it. "It was just me and my mom," she began, her voice low. "My dad left us when I was little. My mom worked hard to raise me on her own. We didn't have much, but we were happy." Edward listened quietly. "Then she got sick, cancer. I tried to take care of her, but I couldn't. She passed away, and I fell into depression. I felt so lost, so alone. I couldn't do anything. I was evicted from the home we lived in." She wiped away a tear that had slipped down. "I didn't have a profession, no diploma. I picked up odd jobs, washing dishes, cleaning houses, but it wasn't enough to pay rent. I found a tiny apartment, but 3 months later, I was evicted again, and then there was nowhere else to go. I ended up on the streets. I started making bracelets to buy food. Edward felt his chest tighten. Without thinking, he pulled her into a hug. A tight hug, full of unspoken things. "You're the strongest person I know," he whispered. Sarah buried her face in his shoulder and let the tears fall. When they pulled apart, their faces were close, very close. Edward looked into her eyes, then at her lips, and before he could think twice, he kissed her. Sarah kissed him back. The kiss was soft, gentle, full of feeling. When they pulled away, she was out of breath. "I'm feeling something for you," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Me too," Edward said, holding her face in his hands. "I felt it for a while." Sarah smiled, but then remembered something important. "We need to take it slow. I don't want to hurt Ethan. He's been through so much. I don't want him to think I'm trying to replace his mother." "You're right." They sat there side by side, holding hands in a quiet, comfortable silence. The following days felt lighter. Edward went back to work, but now spent more time at home. Ethan was smiling again. Life finally seemed to be falling into place. Until one afternoon, while cleaning the room, Sarah found an old box under the bed. It was dusty and forgotten. Curious, she opened it. Inside were old documents from Edward's company, contracts, receipts, payroll forms. Sarah was about to close it when something caught her eye, a name she knew very well. Rebecca Thompson. Her mother. Her heart skipped a beat. She grabbed the document and read it. It was a termination letter dated 10 years ago. "Due to repeated absences and declining productivity, employee Rebecca Thompson is hereby dismissed from her duties, effective immediately." Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her mother had worked at Edward's company and had been fired. Her hands trembled. As she read through more documents, she discovered that the dismissal happened just months before her mother passed away, just months before everything collapsed. And the reason her mother had been sick, missing work for treatments, and instead of getting support, she was let go. Sarah felt the anger rising, burning from the inside. Everything made sense now: the poverty, the desperation, her mother's death, and Edward was at the center of it all. She clutched the documents tightly, tears streaming down her face. How could she love someone knowing his company had destroyed her mother's life and hers? Sarah went downstairs with the documents clutched in her hand. Her heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of her chest. She found Edward in his office, focused on papers spread out across the desk. She knocked on the door hard. Edward looked up, surprised. "Sarah, what happened?" She threw the documents onto the desk, the pages scattered everywhere. "Care to explain this?" Edward picked up one of the sheets and began to read. His expression slowly shifted from confusion to shock. "Where did you get this?" "Found it in an old box under the bed." He kept reading, his face growing paler by the second. "Rebecca Thompson," he murmured. "That name, that's my mother," Sarah shouted, already in tears. "My mother worked for your company, and you fired her because she was sick." Edward jumped to his feet. "Sarah, I didn't know." "You didn't know? How could you not know? It's your company. That was 10 years ago. I barely worked there at the time." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "There's always an excuse, isn't there? Always someone else to blame." "Wait. Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain. My mother was fired while fighting cancer. She lost her job, lost her health insurance, and not long after she died." Her voice cracked at the last word. Edward ran a hand down his face. Desperate. "Oh my God. Sarah, I swear I didn't know. Back then, my father was running everything. I only took over after he retired." Sarah froze, trying to process what he'd said. "Your father? He was strict, cold. He made decisions without thinking about people. I've spent years trying to undo the damage he caused." She looked into his eyes, searching for lies. But all she saw was sincerity and pain. "Even if it was your father, it's still your company. It's still your name." "I know." Silence fell heavy between them. Sarah wiped her tears and took a step back. "I thought this place was different. I thought I had finally found somewhere I belonged. But all of this, it was just an illusion." "It wasn't an illusion. What we built here is real." "How can it be real when it was built on lies?" Edward tried to move closer, but she raised her hand, asking him to stay back. "I need to leave." "Sarah, please." "No, it's over." She turned and ran upstairs to her room. Edward stayed in the office, feeling the world collapse around him. Half an hour later, Sarah came down with her backpack on. She walked straight past the living room without looking back. That's when she saw Ethan standing by the door holding a piece of paper. Her heart broke. The boy's eyes were red, his hands trembling. He handed her the paper. Sarah took it and read the words written in a child's handwriting. "Family doesn't run away." She closed her eyes, holding the paper to her chest. She wanted to stay. She wanted to hug that boy and tell him everything would be all right, but she couldn't. "I'm sorry, champ," she whispered, kneeling to hug him. "I have to go." Ethan hugged her back, crying silently. When Sarah pulled away and walked out the door, it felt like she was tearing her own heart out. The days that followed were empty. Sarah went back to the park, to the same old bench, to the same routine of selling bracelets, but nothing was the same. Everything felt dull, lifeless. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Ethan completely shut down. He stopped eating properly, stopped playing, and spent his days staring out the window, hoping Sarah would come back. Edward tried to talk to him, but the boy barely looked at him. One night, while putting Ethan to bed, Edward noticed the piece of paper the boy had written, still tucked under his pillow. "Family doesn't run away." He sat on the edge of the bed and held his son's hand. "You're right," he said softly. "Family doesn't run, and I'm going to bring her back." The next day, Edward made a decision. He met with his lawyers and announced he would donate a significant part of his fortune to a social program focused on helping people who lost their jobs due to health issues. "I want this to be public," he said. "I want everyone to know we're making things right." The lawyers tried to argue, but he wouldn't budge. After that, he went out searching for Sarah. He drove all over the city, went to every place he thought she might be, until finally he found her. But she wasn't at the park. She was at a small community center in Brooklyn, surrounded by children. She was teaching sign language, using exaggerated gestures that made the kids laugh. Edward stood at the door watching. Even after everything, even with a broken heart, she was still helping others. Sarah turned and saw him. Her smile disappeared. She said something to the children and stepped out the side door, heading straight to the street. Edward ran after her. "Sarah, wait." She walked faster, but he caught up. "Please, just listen to me. I don't have anything to listen to. I donated part of my fortune to a social program to help people who were unfairly fired because of health issues like your mother." Sarah stopped, but didn't turn around. "I can't change the past," Edward went on, his voice tight. "I can't bring your mother back, but I can try to do better from now on. And I need you for that." She finally turned, tears streaming down her face. "Why? Why me?" "Because you taught me how to be better, because you brought my son back to me, because I love you." Sarah's eyes widened. "Don't say that. It's the truth. I love you, Sarah, and I know I messed everything up, but please give me a chance to make it right." She shook her head, overwhelmed, emotional, not knowing what to say. That's when they heard the sound. An engine revving, tires screeching on the pavement. Sarah turned and saw a car speeding toward her, out of control. There was no time to react. Edward shouted and tried to pull her out of the way, but it was too late. The car came to a sudden stop, tires smoking, and halted just inches from her. Sarah fell to the ground, her heart racing, her body shaking. Edward dropped to his knees beside her, holding her tightly. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still in shock. The driver got out, pale as a sheet. "Oh my God. I'm so sorry. The brakes failed. I couldn't stop." Edward helped Sarah to her feet, and the two of them stood there, holding each other, breathing deeply, trying to process what had just happened. "You almost died," Edward whispered, holding her close. Sarah buried her face in his shoulder, and for the first time in days, let herself feel the fear, the relief, and something else. Something she had tried to deny, but it was there, strong and real. She still loved him, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way back. When Sarah opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was a white ceiling, then fluorescent lights, and finally the steady beep of a monitor beside her. Hospital. She blinked, trying to understand what had happened. Her head hurt. Actually, her whole body hurt. She turned her face and saw Ethan sitting in a chair, his eyes fixed on her. When he realized she was awake, his face lit up. He started signing quickly. "You're awake. You're okay." Sarah gave a faint smile and tried to sign back, but her arms felt heavy. "Easy, champ. Slow down." Ethan moved closer to the bed and gently held her hand like she might break. "Don't leave," he signed, eyes full of tears. "Please don't leave again." Sarah's heart tightened. She squeezed his hand back. "He won't." That's when she noticed someone else in the room. Edward was standing near the window, arms crossed, looking exhausted. It seemed like he hadn't slept in days. When their eyes met, he slowly walked over. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." "Or almost did." He gave a faint smile. "The doctor said you were lucky, just a few scrapes and a scare. Nothing serious." "Lucky? I nearly got flattened in front of a community center." Edward chuckled softly. and Sarah realized how much she had missed that sound. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, gently holding her hand. "You gave me the biggest scare of my life." "Sorry, I didn't mean to." There was a quiet pause. Ethan carefully climbed onto the bed and lay down next to Sarah, resting his head on her shoulder. Edward looked at the two of them and felt his chest tighten with emotion. "You taught me how to hear what silence screams," he said softly. Sarah raised her eyebrows and laughed. "That was way too poetic for a man in a suit. I learned from the best." She smiled, and for the first time in days, she felt like maybe things could fall back into place. In the days that followed, while Sarah recovered in the hospital, something unexpected happened. A local reporter showed up in her room along with a cameraman. "Sarah Thompson?" he asked. Excited, Sarah looked at him, suspicious. "Who's asking?" "My name is Tom Harris. I'm a reporter with Channel 7. I saw your videos teaching sign language. They went viral." "Viral? Millions of views. People are loving it. You're becoming a symbol of resilience and inclusion." Sarah blinked, confused. "A symbol? I was just teaching signs. But you did it in such a human, honest way. People connected with it. We want to do a story about you." Edward, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, stood up. "She's recovering. This isn't the time for interviews. Just 5 minutes. I promise we won't tire her out." Sarah looked at Edward, then at the reporter. "It's all right. 5 minutes." The interview was short but meaningful. Sarah talked about Ethan, how learning sign language changed her life, and about empathy and inclusion. When the segment aired that night, the response was overwhelming. Social media blew up. Sarah gained thousands of followers. Supportive messages poured in from everywhere. "You inspired me to learn sign language. My daughter is deaf, and I've never seen anyone talk about this with such care. The world needs more people like you." But along with the attention came pressure. 2 days later, while Sarah was still in the hospital, a man in a suit walked into the room. He was tall, tan, with very white teeth, and a rehearsed smile. "Sarah Thompson." "Finally," he said, extending his hand. "My name is David Clean, executive producer at Network Plus." Sarah shook his hand, unsure. "Nice to meet you. I'm here with a proposal that could change your life." Edward, who was helping Ethan with homework in the corner, looked up, instantly alert. "What kind of proposal?" Sarah asked. David pulled up a chair and sat down full of energy. "We want to turn your story into a reality show. Picture this. From the streets to stardom, Sarah's journey. We follow your life, your sign language lessons, your relationship with Ethan, everything." Sarah's eyes widened. "A reality show about me?" "Exactly. You're authentic, inspiring, real. The audience will love it." Edward stood up and crossed his arms. "She's not doing that." David looked at him, surprised. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrington, I think that's her decision. And I think you're trying to take advantage of someone in a vulnerable position." "Take advantage?" "I'm offering her an opportunity." Sarah raised her hand, interrupting. "All right, both of you let me think." David smiled, confident. "Of course, just don't take too long. We have others interested in the slot." He left a business card on the table beside her bed and walked out. When the door closed, Edward turned to Sarah. "You're not going to accept that, are you?" "Why not?" "Because those shows destroy people. They edit everything, twist the story, and turn your life into a circus. Or it could be a chance to reach even more people to teach sign language to millions." Edward shook his head. "This isn't about teaching. It's about ratings. About money." Sarah sighed. Tired. "Edward, I spent my whole life being invisible. And now, for the first time, people are paying attention. Maybe that's a good thing. Or maybe it's a trap." She looked at him. "You don't trust me to make this decision." "I trust you. I just don't trust them." Ethan, who'd been watching silently, signed, "What are you two arguing about?" Sarah smiled and replied in sign language, "Just boring adult stuff." He laughed. That night, alone in the hospital room, Sarah picked up David's card and stared at it. The offer was tempting. A lot of money, national exposure, the chance to make a difference on a bigger scale. But Edward was right. There were risks, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for all of that. She put the card in the drawer and closed her eyes, trying to rest. But sleep didn't come easily. The decision weighed on her, and deep down Sarah knew that whatever choice she made would change everything for better or worse. She didn't know yet, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same. 3 days later, Sarah was discharged from the hospital. She returned to the mansion, but the atmosphere had changed tense. Edward barely spoke to her, and every time the subject of the reality show came up, He changed the topic. One morning during breakfast, David Clean called, "Sarah, how's your recovery going? Getting better? Great. Because I have amazing news. I got $1 million contract approved for you. $1 million for a full season of the reality show." Sarah nearly dropped her glass of juice. "A million? That's right. You deserve it, sweetheart. Your story is going to inspire the whole country." Edward, who was reading the newspaper across the table, immediately looked up. "I need to think about it," Sarah said nervously. "Of course, but don't take too long. The offer expires in 48 hours. She hung up and found Edward staring at her. "A million?" he asked in a tone she couldn't quite read. "That's what he said." Edward folded the newspaper and tossed it on the table. "And you're thinking of accepting it? Maybe." "Sarah, that's crazy. Crazy is turning down $1 million. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. These shows will tear you apart. They'll take your story and turn it into cheap entertainment. Or maybe they'll give me a platform to make a real difference." "Difference? They just want ratings. They'll edit everything and make you look ridiculous." Sarah stood up too, upset. "Do you think I'm ridiculous?" "No, but they'll make it seem like you are. Maybe you're just afraid I won't need you anymore once I have my own money." The words came out harsher than she intended. Edward froze as if she had slapped him. "Is that really what you think of me?" Sarah looked away, regretful. "I don't know what to think." Edward grabbed his car keys. "Do whatever you want, Sarah. But don't say I didn't warn you." He walked out, slamming the door. Ethan, who had been quietly watching the whole thing, signed to Sarah. "Did you two fight?" She sighed and replied, "Grown-ups are complicated, champ." That afternoon, Sarah called David and accepted the offer. 2 days later, she signed the papers. A week after that, filming began. At first, everything seemed perfect. A professional crew, beautiful sets, interesting questions. Ça felt important, heard, but little by little, she started noticing strange things. The questions got more and more invasive. The writers kept pushing certain parts of the story, talk more about how hard life was on the streets. The director would say, "Try to cry a little if you can." "I didn't cry that much," Sarah would answer, "but we need to move the audience." Then came the day of the live show, a 2-hour special, telling Sarah's full story. The studio was packed, the audience excited, cameras everywhere. Sarah was backstage wearing an outfit she didn't choose when she heard the show's intro. Tonight, the inspiring story of a woman who went from the streets into the arms of a billionaire. Sarah Thompson, the homeless woman who won New York's heart. She froze. Homeless woman into a billionaire's arms? "That's not right," she whispered. The stagehand gave her a gentle nudge. "It's time. Let's go." Sarah walked onto the stage to loud applause. She sat in the chair next to the host, a man with a wide smile and perfect teeth. "Sarah Thompson, what an honor to have you here. Thank you. Your story is incredible. A homeless woman with nothing, and suddenly you're rescued by a charming billionaire." Sarah frowned. "That's not exactly what happened." "Of course it is. You were selling bracelets when Edward Harrington found you and changed your life." "He didn't change my life. I changed my life." The host laughed like she told a joke. Such humility. "But we all know that without him, you'd still be on the streets." Something inside Sarah snapped. She looked at the cameras, at the audience, at the monitors showing her face close-up, and she saw exactly what Edward had warned her about. They were turning her story into a fairy tale, the poor girl rescued by the rich prince. "No," she said firmly. The host blinked. "Excuse me?" Sarah stood up. "No, this is wrong. Sarah, please sit down. We're live. I know we're live, and that's exactly why I need to speak." She turned to the cameras, took a deep breath, and began, "You want to hear my story? I'll tell you the truth. I lived on the streets. I went hungry. I slept out in the cold. But you know what? I never was a victim waiting to be saved. No one saves anyone. That idea that we need a hero to pull us out of the hole, that's a lie. We heal when someone believes in us, when someone sees our worth. Edward didn't save me. He saw me. He gave me a chance. But I did the work." She pointed at the camera. "And if there's anyone out there going through a hard time, hear this. You don't need a billionaire. You need an opportunity and someone who believes you're capable because you are." Tears were streaming down her face. "Now I'm not the beggar who got saved. I'm the woman who stood up, and no one can take that away from me." She took off the lapel mic and placed it on the table. "Thank you for the opportunity. But I'm not going to be part of a story that isn't mine." And she walked off the stage. The audience burst into applause. The host was speechless. The producers were panicking backstage, but Sarah didn't care. She grabbed her things and left the studio, On the other side of the city at the mansion, Edward was watching everything on TV. Ethan was next to him, both of them glued to the screen. When Sarah gave her speech, Edward felt a tightness in his chest. Her words echoed inside him, touching places that had been closed off for years. "My God," he whispered, "I love this woman." Ethan looked at his dad and smiled, signing, "I knew it." Edward jumped to his feet. "Where are you going?" Ethan signed. "To get her." He grabbed the car keys and ran out. He drove through the streets of New York like a madman, heart racing. He didn't know exactly where she'd be, but he had a hunch, and he was right. When he got to the park, he saw her sitting on the same bench where it all started, looking up at the sky. Edward parked and got out slowly. He walked up to her, hands in his pockets. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah looked at him, eyes still red, and nodded. "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment, just feeling the night breeze. "I saw your speech," Edward finally said, "and it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Sarah laughed, wiping her tears. "I ruined everything. I walked off in the middle of a live taping. You didn't ruin anything. You were honest." He turned to her, taking her hand in it. "You were right. I never saved you. You saved me. You taught me what really matters. You taught me how to be a father again. You taught me how to love again." Sarah felt her heart race. "Edward, I love you, Sarah. And it's not because you're a symbol or an inspiration. It's because you're you, funny, stubborn, brave. You make me want to be better." She smiled, tears returning. But this time they were happy tears. "I love you too, you idiot." He laughed and pulled her into a kiss, a long, deep kiss full of promises. When they pulled away, Sarah leaned her forehead against his. "So now what? Now we start over the right way?" She smiled. "On a park bench. If it's with you, it can be anywhere." And right there on the bench where it all began, Sarah and Edward found not an ending, but a new beginning. Because sometimes love doesn't come to rescue, it comes to add. And that made all the difference. The night was cold, but Sarah barely noticed. She felt warm there in Edward's arms, sitting on the bench that had witnessed the start of it all. "Funny," she said, looking around. "Just a few months ago, I was here selling bracelets, never imagining my life would turn upside down." Edward smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I never imagined I'd meet someone like you either in the middle of a park, making jokes about pigeons." Sarah laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Who would have thought, huh?" The millionaire became the beggar's student. Edward let out a genuine laugh. "And the beggar became the heart of my home." They looked at each other, and the world around them seemed to fade away. Edward leaned in and kissed her again, slowly, gently, like they had all the time in the world. When they pulled away, they heard footsteps. They turned and saw Ethan running toward them, a huge smile on his face. "Champ," Sarah signed, surprised. "How did you get here?" Ethan pointed to the driver waiting near the car, waving from a distance. "I asked him to bring me. I knew you'd be here." He climbed up onto the bench between them and made a sign that made both of them laugh. "Marriage." Sarah blushed right away. "Hey, slow down. Who said anything about marriage?" Ethan insisted, making the sign again, this time pointing at both of them with extra emphasis. Edward laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Looks like someone already decided our future. He's a bit bossy, isn't he?" Sarah joked. Ethan crossed his arms, pretending to be offended, but his smile gave him away. The three of them stayed there for a while longer, chatting in signs, laughing, enjoying the simplicity of that moment. No cameras, no spotlights, just them. 2 weeks later, Sarah was helping Ethan with his homework when the mail arrived. Among the bills and ads, there was an official envelope. Her name was written by hand in old-fashioned, careful handwriting. "What's this?" she murmured, opening the envelope. Inside was a letter from the law firm Miller & Associates. "Dear Sarah Thompson, we inform you that you have been identified as the sole heir to the property located at 428 Maple Street, Brooklyn, NY. The house belonged to your late mother, Rebecca Thompson, and is now legally in your name. For more information, please contact us." Sarah read the letter 3 times, unable to believe it. "A house?" she whispered. "My mom had a house." Ethan noticed her expression and signed. "What happened?" I think I inherited a house." She showed the letter to Edward, who had just gotten home from work. "Is this for real?" he asked, reading quickly. "Looks like it, but I don't understand. My mom never owned a house. We always rented." Edward picked up the phone. "I'll call the office and schedule a visit. We need to see this ourselves." The next day, the three of them went to the address. It was an old neighborhood in Brooklyn with small houses and trees lining the sidewalks. When the car stopped in front of number 428, Sarah felt her heart race. The house was simple, 2 stories, peeling paint, overgrown garden, but something about it felt familiar, like it touched a deep part of Sarah's memory. "I know this place," she murmured. "I've been here before." The lawyer was waiting at the door, holding a folder of documents. "Miss Thompson, I'm James Miller. Nice to meet you. This house, it really belonged to my mother?" "Yes. Purchased in 1995. Fully paid off by 2003. She never sold it, but she never came back either." Sarah looked at the house, trying to piece things together. Why didn't she ever tell me? James hesitated. "Well, according to the documents we found, your mother left this house suddenly in 2005. There are police reports involving domestic violence." Sarah's legs felt weak. "Violence?" "Yes. Your father, Daniel Thompson, was arrested several times for assault. Your mother fled the house with you. You were 5 at the time and never came back. She probably kept the property as a backup, but never returned out of fear of being found." Sarah covered her mouth with her hand as tears began to fall. "I didn't know. I barely remember anything from that time." Edward held her hand tightly. "Your mother protected you. She did what she had to do." James handed her the keys. "The house is yours now. You can do whatever you want with it." Sarah took the keys, the metal cold and heavy in her hand. They went inside together. The interior was dusty, with furniture covered in old sheets and a musty smell in the air. Still, there were memories hidden in every corner. Sarah stopped in the living room and closed her eyes. Suddenly, images came back. Her younger self playing on the floor, her mother smiling, singing a song, and then yelling, things breaking. "Fear. She saved me," Sarah whispered. "She gave up everything to protect me." Edward wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And now you can honor that. Turn this place into something new." Sarah looked around, her mind starting to turn. "I know what I want to do," she said, turning to him. "I want to turn this house into a school, a sign language school, free for kids in need, for families who can't afford it, a place where everyone is heard, even in silence." Edward smiled, proud. "It's perfect." Ethan, who had been exploring the rooms, came running back and signed, "Can I help?" Sarah knelt down and signed back. "Of course you can. You'll be the assistant teacher." He jumped with excitement, and the 3 of them hugged right there in the middle of a house once filled with pain, now about to be filled with hope. In the following weeks, the renovation began. Edward hired a construction team. Sarah picked the colors, planned the rooms, and thought through every little detail. They painted the walls a soft yellow, installed big windows to let in the light, built a spacious classroom with boards, teaching materials, and even a small stage for performances. Sarah worked day and night, pouring love into every repaired wall and corner. And as the house came back to life, Sarah felt herself being rebuilt too, not just surviving, but thriving. One afternoon, while they were hanging posters of the sign language alphabet on the walls, Edward paused and looked at her. "Are you happy?" Sarah smiled, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "More than I ever thought I could be." He stepped closer and gently held her face in his hands. "Then answer me something. What? Would you spend the rest of your life with me?" Sarah's eyes widened. "You're proposing in the middle of a renovation?" "Technically, Ethan already did. I'm just making it official." She laughed, tears welling up again. "You don't even have a ring." "I have this." He pulled one of the bracelets Sarah had made months ago from his pocket, the same one he'd kept since the very first day. "It's not a diamond, but it means a lot more." Sarah looked at the bracelet, at the man standing in front of her, and felt her heart overflow. "Yes," she said, smiling 1,000 times. "Yes." And right there, in a house that had once been filled with fear but was now becoming a symbol of new beginnings, Sarah and Edward made one more promise, that together they could turn any ruin into a home. 6 months later, the house was unrecognizable. What once was a place marked by pain now shone with new life. The yellow walls reflected the sunlight. The large windows let in the fresh air, and a colorful garden decorated the front. At the gate, the hand-painted wooden sign read, "Hope Sign School, everyone is welcome here." It was opening day. Dozens of people gathered in the garden. Children ran across the lawn, parents chatted excitedly, and the local press was there to cover it all. Sarah stood in the middle of the crowd, wearing a simple peach-colored dress, her hair loose in the wind. She was smiling so much, her cheeks already hurt. Edward walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her. "Nervous a little? What if no one wants to learn?" He pointed to the dozens of people around them. "I think that fear already passed." Sarah laughed and turned to him. "Thank you for believing in me, for making this possible. I just gave the money. You gave it the heart." Ethan came running over holding the hand of a girl his age. She also used sign language, and the two were excitedly talking with their hands. Dad, Sarah, this is Julia. She's deaf like me. Sarah crouched down and greeted the girl in signs. Hi, Julia, welcome. The girl smiled shyly and replied, thank you. I've never had a teacher who spoke my language. Sarah's heart swelled. That made it all worth it. The opening was a success. Sarah taught the first class, showing basic signs to a mixed group of children and adults. At the end, everyone applauded, and she knew without a doubt she was exactly where she was meant to be. When night fell and the guests had gone, Sarah, Edward, and Ethan stayed in the garden, resting on plastic chairs. Tired? Edward asked, exhausted but happy. Ethan was lying on the grass looking at the stars. Suddenly, he sat up and signed something. Dad, when are you going to propose to her for real? Edward almost choked on his water. What? You gave her a bracelet? That's not a real proposal. You need a ring. On one knee, the whole thing. Sarah burst into laughter. He's right. Edward looked at the two of them, stunned. Did you two plan this? No. Sarah and Ethan replied at the same time, one with signs, the other with his voice. Edward shook his head, but he was smiling. Okay, you win. 3 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday, Edward asked Sarah to go for a drive. Where are we going? She asked as he drove. It's a surprise. They arrived at the same park where it all began. Sarah looked around, confused. Why are we here? You'll see. He led her to the bench, and that's when Sarah noticed there were balloons tied to the trees, flower petals scattered on the ground, and Ethan standing in the middle of it, all holding a sign. Sarah read the sign and burst out laughing. She said yes once. Let's try again with witnesses. You two are ridiculous, Sarah shouted, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. Edward knelt down in front of the bench and pulled a small box from his pocket. Sarah Thompson, you are the most amazing, funny, stubborn, and brave woman I've ever met. You changed my life, my son's life, and the lives of dozens of people. You taught me how to listen, how to feel, how to truly love. Will you marry me for real this time? Sarah wiped away her tears, still laughing. With a ring and everything? With a ring and everything. She held out her hand, trembling. Yes, of course. Yes. Edward slipped the ring on her finger. It was simple, delicate, perfect. They kissed while Ethan clapped and cheered. 2 months later, the big day arrived. The wedding would take place in the school garden, a place that represented everything they had built together. The decorations were simple but beautiful. Lights hung from the trees, wildflowers in vases, white chairs arranged in rows. A small wooden altar was draped with light fabrics. Sarah was in one of the school's rooms adjusting her dress. It was white, light, with delicate lace on the shoulders. Nothing fancy, but perfect for her. There was a knock on the door. Come in. Ethan walked in wearing a tiny suit that made him look like a miniature grown-up. He stopped and looked her up and down, his eyes wide. You look beautiful, he signed. Thank you, champ. You look very handsome too. He laughed, then made another sign. Ready to be my mom? Sarah felt her eyes sting. She knelt down in front of him and held his small hands. I felt like your mom for a long time. Ethan hugged her tightly, and they stayed like that for a moment in silence. But saying everything, the ceremony began with the sound of a soft guitar. The guests were seated, smiling. Sarah walked down the improvised aisle. No veil, no grand entrance, just herself. When she reached the altar and saw Edward waiting, her heart started to race. He looked handsome in his light blue suit, his eyes shining with emotion. The officiant began the ceremony, but before the formal words, Ethan stepped forward and came up to the altar. He signed to the audience, and someone translated aloud, "Love speaks all languages. It doesn't need sound to be heard. It doesn't need words to be understood. My dad and Sarah taught me that, and today, I'm the happiest person in the world because they're becoming a real family." The audience was moved. Some people were openly crying. Sarah looked at Edward and signed just for him. Now you've learned how to listen with your heart. He smiled, eyes full of tears, and returned the same sign slowly, carefully. The officiant continued. And when it was time for the vows, Sarah spoke first. Edward, I spent so much time thinking I needed to be saved, but you showed me that I've always been strong. You didn't save me. You saw me, and that changed everything. I promise to love you, to support you, and to remind you every day that you are so much more than you think. Edward wiped away a tear and began, Sarah, you came into my life like a storm. You turned everything upside down, and thank God for that. You pulled me out of my comfort zone, made me laugh again, taught me how to be a real father. I promise to listen to you always with my ears, my eyes, and most of all, with my heart. Ethan brought the rings on a small cushion, beaming with pride. They exchanged rings, and when the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," the audience erupted in applause. The celebration was simple live music, homemade food, and heartfelt laughter. There was no luxury, but there was plenty of love. Sarah and Edward danced their first song in the middle of the garden, under lights gently swaying in the breeze. "Happy?" he asked, spinning her slowly. "More than I ever thought possible." Ethan joined the dance, and soon others did too. Children ran between tables, adults chatted excitedly. Everything felt just right. Later, as the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Sarah and Edward sat on a bench in the garden looking at the stars. "We did it," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did. From living on the streets to owning a school. From being alone to being married. Who would have thought?" "Huh." Edward kissed her forehead. "I always knew you were special. Liar. You thought I was crazy." He laughed, maybe a little, but it was exactly the kind of crazy I needed. They stayed there in silence, holding hands, watching the garden lights go out one by one. And Sarah realized something: she wasn't searching for a place to call home anymore. Because home wasn't a place. It was people. Edward, who truly saw her. Ethan, who loved her unconditionally. And that school born out of pain, now blooming with hope. A love born from silence. Unending.